Film is a beautiful art. For most, movies are background noise, a place you go to, or at best, mild entertainment. Then there's cinephiles like me, who love to see the technological marvels, creative storytelling, and the synergy of human artistic talent coming together to create marvelous works. We Americans are cinematically spoiled. We have a rich and long film culture that has existed for about 110 years, and it contains various genres, stories, and peoples. Unfortunately, our deep history includes two massive sins. Firstly, Hollywood has sanitized a lot of our controversial and hateful actions against our own people and those abroad. Secondly, we tend to disregard the cinema of other cultures, especially from cultures we see as impoverished and underdeveloped. The people of Mexico has been trespassed by both sins. Even before Hollywood, American filmmakers have portrayed Mexicans poorly. At best, we're humble peasants. At worst, we're evil seductresses and drug traffickers. And yes, I said we. As a Mexican American, I've been stuck between two countries that seem to be at each other's throats. But I feel as much American as I am Mexican. And above those two labels, I'm a cinephile. I love movies. There's already so many videos on the American golden age of cinema, but almost none on the Mexican golden age of cinema. And for someone who grew up watching media from both, it's such a shame because there's truly something human, sincere, and impressive about Mexican cinema, especially when you look at the history and the creative minds behind it. So instead of focusing on our issues, let's come together and learn about Mexican movies and how the golden age of Mexican cinema has stood the test of time. We begin in 1896, when French inventors Auguste and Louis Lumière introduced Mexicans to movies for the first time. The first films were short, minute-long documentaries called Actualités. These primitive recordings of people doing things had no fancy camera movements, clever editing, or amazing lighting techniques. All that would be developed later. Mexico, unfortunately, wouldn't take part in that development, as the country was in the 20th year of General Porfirio Díaz's presidency, a period of time known as the Porfiriato. Under his presidency, Díaz led Mexico into an age of scientific and technological progress, for the 3% of Mexicans who lived in urban and wealthy areas. His regime was also filled with corruption, lobbying from American companies who wanted to exploit Mexico's natural resources, a secret police that silenced critics, and rigging elections to ensure his continual power. This would all change in 1910, when the Mexican Revolution began. The revolution saw a decade of war and the end of Díaz's regime. It turned Mexico upside down, both politically, but also socially and artistically. From the legal reforms of Francisco Madero, the socialist and indigenous rights platforms of Emiliano Zapata, the guerrilla tactics and self-determinationist policies of Pancho Villa, and Venustiano Carranza's call for constitutional reform, these rich and influential ideas were fought for not only with bullets and cavalry charges, but also represented on murals, paintings, books, and of course, the movie screen. By 1917, Carranza's constitutionalist faction had conquered most of Mexico and ratified Mexico's current constitution. Most Mexicans were tired of documentaries that showed the awful war and death. Many needed to escape the conflict that had killed 1.5 million of their compatriots. The silent narrative films called filmes de argumento, or literally plot films, were written, but only a few of them were actually recorded and released. But the first one was released in 1919. It was documentarian Enrique Rosas' El Automóvil Gris. Released as a miniseries of 12 silent shorts, it follows the true story of a Carrancista detective in Mexico City who attempts to capture a gang of burglars disguised as soldiers who travel between heists in a gray Fiat. The movie was revolutionary for using the real locations where the burglaries happened, mixing documentary footage of the capture of the burglars, even including their real execution on screen, and mixing it with reenactments that include actors and members of the Mexico City police force, including the real detective who actually caught them. The movie also paid homage to José Guadalupe Posadas' work and mixed Italian melodramatic acting with American theatrical camera angles to create a unique and Mexican experience that resonated with a burnt-out population. Despite El Automóvil Gris's critical and financial success, there never was a surge of Mexican silent films. Rosas would die in 1920, never making another movie. In fact, less than 30 Mexican silent narratives were ever made, with many Mexicans preferring to watch foreign comedies, especially from the United States. So it seemed Mexico's film industry was never going to take off. That was until a certain invention made itself heard around the world. Literally. Mommy. Mommy. In 1927, on the other side of El Rio Bravo, or Rio Grande if you're American, Warner Bros. Released The Jazz Singer, the first film with synchronized audio. While at first seen as a fad, American film companies rushed to get their own talking movies out. It wouldn't take long before Mexicans had their own hand on audio synchronizing tech. But not in the way you think. You see, Mexicans have worked behind the scene in Hollywood since the beginning. Many were technicians, assistants, or laborers that were undervalued because they were laborers and because they weren't American. Racist Hollywood producers made it difficult for Mexican filmmakers to get access to audio equipment. This was resolved when twins Roberto and Joselito Rodriguez invented their own sound synchronizing technology in 1930. This ensured Mexican filmmakers a cheaper alternative than to depend on the racist Hollywood contractors for audio. Additionally, the 1917 Constitution had strong labor and pro-unionist laws that promoted collaboration between artists and manufacturers. This enticed Spanish director Antonio Moreno and various experienced Mexican filmmakers to leave Hollywood and return to Mexico. With what seems like divine intervention, all these great people and inventions synergized in Mexico. The result? 1932's Santa.
Mira, Santita, me quedo en el pueblo en destacamento. Si quieres nos veremos para...
This movie was an instant hit and kickstarted the Mexican film industry. Additionally, history added the prime ingredients for a golden age in 1936. First was the rise of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. American President Franklin Delano Roosevelt wanted to ensure Latin American friendship in case of war. This led to the enactment of the Good Neighbor policy in 1936, where the United States gave money to many Latin American countries, opened up equal trading opportunities, and relaxed their racist depictions of Latina people in exchange for allegiance against Nazism. With this new money, Mexico could invest in itself, leading to the Mexican economic miracle of the 1940s, seeing an increase in economic, scientific, legal, and for our sake, artistic value and production. The Banco Cinematográfico was established. The bank gave loans and funding to many film companies, including Clasa, Azteca Filmes, Films Mundial, and Tepeyac. Secondly, as part of the Good Neighbor policy, Hollywood execs agreed to help supply Mexican films and to cease exporting American films. This allowed Mexican theaters to run only Mexican movies, uncontested by Hollywood's own Golden Age productions. Additionally, the United States entry into World War II in 1941 resulted in less manpower being spent on filmmaking. Even though Mexico did join World War II in 1942, its contribution was focused on trade with the Allied powers, only supplying one aerial battalion to fight the Japanese in 1945. Case in point, Mexico had more people and time to spend on making movies. And that leads us to our last detail. There were many visionaries who were willing to take big risks. Agustin Fink was a producer who allowed creatives many freedoms. At the same time, Soviet filmmaker Sergei Eisenstein, yes, that Eisenstein, tried to make a documentary called Que Viva Mexico, which focused on Mexican iconography, culture, and people. While the film was never released, many Mexicans got their experience filming with him and were inspired by his search for Mexicanidad, or Mexicanness, inspiring the overt use of Mexican cultural objects in Mexican movies. All resulted in Mexico getting itself a cinematic golden age. The golden age of Mexican cinema happened between the late 1930s and the mid-1950s. So what exactly makes them so golden? Well, first we have to split up Mexican Golden Age films into two categories. These categories were made by Professor Charles Ramirez Berg of the University of Texas, Austin. These categories are the mainstream Mexican cinema, or MMC, and the classical Mexican cinema, or CMC. Let's begin with the mainstream Mexican cinema. MMC movies were those that were box office successes and are popular culture icons in Mexico. In fact, all the movies I grew up watching were MMC movies. Most MMC films were comedies and musicals. This makes sense as Mexico's top highest grossing films of all time are all comedies. It also helps that Mexico is a very optimistic and happy culture. Or as this interview with Guillermo del Toro reveals,
they have an extraordinary ability to look into the shadow side, into the darker side
Yes.
of human nature and fantasy
Yes.
and terror. But you also are a really joyful and loving person.
Yes.
So how do you find that balance?
I'm Mexican.
Then there's also government censorship. When Venustiano Carranza's faction did win the revolution in 1920, he would be assassinated by his own faction. The victors formed the PNR, the National Revolutionary Party, in 1929, later rebranding to the current PRI, or the Institutionalized Revolutionary Party, in 1949. While not historically accurate, that's what I'll be calling them for the rest of the video. The PRI used fraudulent elections, bribery, disappearances, and massacres to stay in power until the year 2000. This control extended to movies, limiting the type of stories and political commentary that Mexican filmmakers could make, and contributed to safer comedies being produced. Still, MMC movies are iconic and as important to Mexican culture as tacos and mariachi. These films include the comedies of Cantinflas, real name Mario Fortino Alfonso Moreno Reyes, short am I right, where he plays the character of a Mexican hobo whose comical miscommunications lead to hijinks. He was called the greatest comedian to ever live by Charlie Chaplin, and the word cantinflear was actually created in his honor. Then there's Jorge Negrete, Pedro Infante, Tintan, Dolores del Rio, Maria Felix, and Silvia Pinal. I'm just scratching the surface, but these actors, their movies, and their musicals are all testament to Mexican culture and have made many families laugh, cry, and smile. I know mine did. The classic Mexican cinema, or the CMC, includes movies that are internationally recognized for their artistic value, storytelling, and the unique portrait they paint of the Mexican experience. The Golden Age had three auteurs who shall be the focus of this video. The first is Fernando de Fuentes. De Fuentes got his experience working with Eisenstein in Que Viva Mexico, and was inspired by the depiction of the working class from the Mexican muralist movement. He was also critical of the PRI, believing they failed to finish the revolution's egalitarian reforms. In 1936, De Fuentes directed the beloved musical Allá en el Rancho Grande. The movie is a staple of MMC cinema, despite its positive portrayal of classism and patriarchy. The movie was successfully financial and cemented De Fuentes as a great director, but this movie was really made to cover up his earlier tragic films. Between 1933 and 1936, De Fuentes directed the Revolution trilogy, which included El Prisionero 13, El Compadre Mendoza, and Vámonos con Pancho Villa. The last one was actually voted by film critics to be the greatest Mexican film of the 20th century. And it's no wonder why. De Fuentes' bleak and nihilistic view of the Mexican Revolution is a stark contrast to everything else seen in Mexican cinema. In Vámonos con Pancho Villa, the film follows 6 men who call themselves Los Leones de San Pablo. In 1914, they joined Pancho Villa's crusade against Victoriano Huerta's forces, who had recently usurped the Mexican revolutionary government. As the story continues, the men become disillusioned with Villa's mission and perish in battle, leaving the old Tiburcio alive to tell the tale. The story reflects a Shakespearean-like quality, as Ramirez Berg reflects. The misfortunes that befall the 6 Leones are not the results of character flaws, moral lapses, or bad choices. On the contrary, the Leones are punished for making a good choice. Their downfall comes from deciding to do the honorable and patriotic thing, namely to get involved in the revolution, join Villa, and try to create a better Mexico. As the story progresses, the lighting around Pancho Villa, portrayed by Domingo Soler, decreases. When introduced, Villa is on top of a freight train. The crowd is around him, trying to get food using their hats. It's clear that the scene paints Villa as a Mexican messiah, ready to save his people from Huerta's tyranny. This is heavily contrasted with Villa's final scene. At this point, only Tiburcio and Becerrillo are alive, with the latter dying of smallpox. Villa orders Tiburcio to kill Becerrillo for the good of the revolution. The darkness and the fact that the camera is at eye level confirms that Tiburcio sees Villa as just another warlord, no more better, selfless, or merciful as their counter-revolutionary enemies. This darker lighting is known as chiaroscuro lighting, and De Fuentes also uses it to signal impending doom. It happens here when Tiburcio prepares to end Becerrillo, and it happens earlier when Tiburcio fails to predict his own death, believing that everyone else will outlive him. If only he knew. In the film El Compadre Mendoza, chiaroscuro lighting is also used in its tragic ending. The film follows Rosalio Mendoza, a wealthy landowner who switches sides during the revolution, depending on who has the advantage. At some point, Zapatista General Felipe Nieto becomes his son's godfather and his trusted friend. Unfortunately, Mendoza decides to betray Nieto to the Carrancitas in order to keep his estate safe. The final betrayal is done in chiaroscuro lighting as Mendoza's wife and son flee the massacre. De Fuentes also uses creative frames within a frame to highlight a character or an action. Sometimes he uses Mexican sombreros to direct our attention. He also uses diagonal leading lines to direct the audience's eyes to a certain part of the scene. Despite these masterful cinematic techniques, the Revolution trilogy was a commercial flop, and the PRI censored parts of the films to make them less critical of the revolution and of themselves. So De Fuentes moved on to make musicals and other movies that didn't upset the government for the rest of his career. But as De Fuentes' career shifted, another one began. Emilio El Indio Fernandez was a very wacky man, to say the least. He got his experience in Hollywood in the 1920s, where he claimed to have made many innovations, such as inventing subtitles and even being the model for the Oscar statue. A quick Google search will prove to you that Fernandez was a notorious liar, so a lot of his biographical information should be taken with a grain of salt. What cannot be debated is his contribution to Mexican cinema, or as critic Emilio Garcia Reyra puts it, Emilio Fernandez's movies did not simply represent Mexican cinema, they were Mexican cinema. But Fernandez's genius came with his collaborators. His cinematographer was the great Gabriel Figueroa, who would become Mexico's most prolific cinematographer, with more than 210 movies under his belt, and an Oscar nomination.
Gabriel Figueroa for The Night of the Iguana.
Figueroa was a painter before going to Hollywood, where he would be trained under Greg Toland, who did the cinematography for a little-known film called Citizen Kane.
The boarder that beats his bill and leaves worthless stock behind.
Additionally, author Mauricio Magdalena was Fernandez's script doctor and screenwriter for some of his films. And finally, Gloria Showman would be his editor, and she would have a prolific career, editing more than 200 movies. Fernandez would direct many award-winning films, including La Perla, Enamorada, Flor Silvestre, Salón México, and Víctimas del Pecado. But his most important movie was 1943's María Candelaria. It's the only Mexican movie to win the prestigious Palme d'Or in the Cannes Film Festival. Well, sort of. We'll get to that later. The movie follows María Candelaria, a native Mexican woman portrayed by Dolores del Rio, who is in love with Pedro Armendáriz' character, Lorenzo Rafael, and she's rejected by her tribe because she's the daughter of a prostitute. The plot centers around her struggle against the town's discrimination and her attempts to marry Lorenzo. The film was meant to celebrate the natives of Mexico and show how life before the revolution was awful for native Mexicans, taking place in 1909, the year before the revolution. Yet, despite this noble intent, María Candelaria is a bit racist. Del Rio and Armendáriz are white Mexicans, while the other native Mexicans are played by actual native Mexicans. The main antagonist, Don Damian, played by Miguel Inclán, is a mixed-race man, and the three people who come to the rescue of Maria and Lorenzo are a white Mexican priest, a white Mexican doctor, and a white Mexican painter, conserving a white savior narrative. The irony of it all is that Maria Candelaria is still supposed to be seen as this pure native woman, despite looking European. The film seems to validate the current social structure, with the white criollos at the top, the mixed-race mestizos in the middle, and the indigenous people at the bottom, but it also takes the most rejected indigenous woman and puts her at the top, saying she is pure of heart, like the Virgin. While the movie's reputation has faltered throughout the years, it had a smooth filming process. According to Figueroa himself,
Fernandez let me put the camera wherever I wanted to put, and then next day he saw rushes, and he didn't realize what he has been seeing. I went farther away from his imagination. So from that moment on, he let me put the camera wherever I wanted.
This composition included the thorough and unapologetic use of Mexican symbols. Every shot is trying to tell you, this is Mexico, and we are Mexicans. Maria sells flowers in an indigenous chalupa. When asking for repentance, Maria Candelaria is paired with the Virgin of Guadalupe, a supposed appearance of Mary, the mother of Jesus, to Nahua peasant Juan Diego Coatolatuatzin in 1531, and is the symbol of Mexican Catholicism. The clothing, flea markets, and the spoken accent is all indicative of central Mexico, heartland of the former Aztec Empire and the Mexica people. The camera angles are also used to show not only the beauty of the Mexican landscape, but the role of the people in it. When Maria tries to sell flowers in the town, its inhabitants wait around the lake, blending into nature. This equates them to Mexico's land, and this wide shot exemplifies that grandiose weight of the statement that the indigenous people of Mexico cannot be separated from their native lands. Wide shots of skies, known as Figueroa skies, serve to grant autonomy and purity to these characters. In this shot, Maria and Lorenzo are dignified, their faces romantically lit, cementing them as people worthy to live in that land. In La Perla, which follows a native family's descent into madness after discovering a priceless pearl, there's a similar shot when Juana tries to save her husband Kino from some thieves, but he doesn't let her throw the stone so she doesn't become a murderer. This shot glorifies Juana and magnifies her as the light in this very dark and twisted story. In addition to angles, Figueroa and Fernandez play with chiaroscuro lighting, adding a sense of dread and hopelessness to their movies. Returning to Maria Candelaria, Lorenzo is thrown into a prison cell after stealing a wedding dress from Maria. This entire cell is illuminated by a window, visualizing the bright future he could have had with Maria, and having him far from the window demonstrates his literal and figurative distance from that future. In Enamorada, we follow revolutionary Juan Jose Reyes, whose reign of terror over a town is challenged when he falls in love with the mayor's daughter. Classic, I know. In this short scene, Juan is consumed by darkness because of his tyranny, but the priest offers him an exit from his violent life and is consumed with light. With these techniques and memorable stories, the 1940s really was Fernandez's decade. Just as the 1950s belonged to the legendary Luis Buñuel, one of the world's greatest directors. Despite being one of the three Mexican auteurs, Buñuel is actually Spanish. He moved to Mexico after being rejected from Hollywood, France, and Spain for his communist views. He was openly critical of sexism, calling machismo a virus. He disliked the PRI censorship, was critical of the Catholic Church, and hated happy endings, preferring tragedies or bittersweet endings. I bet he was fun at parties. He's internationally known for his European-produced surrealist films, such as Palme d'Or winner Viridiana, which is technically a mixed Spanish-Mexican production, but the Cannes Film Festival gives it to Spain. I promise you that's not the weirdest thing you'll hear about this movie. Anyway, it's considered to be the greatest film ever made in the Spanish language. There's also The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie and Belle de Jour. Still, it was in Mexico where he perfected his surrealist style with the award-winning film Los Olvidados, released in 1950. Buñuel was known for his short production time. He finished filming Los Olvidados in 3 weeks, and it was edited in 1, an impressive feat for a 1 hour and 20-minute film. The cinematography was also done by Gabriel Figueroa, which you're going to find out he's kind of inescapable. The movie follows the life of 3 orphaned boys in Mexico City. Pedro, a poor boy who lives with his single mother, who gets pulled into the criminal activities of a juvenile delinquent called El Jaibo, whose crimes extend from petty theft to murder. We also follow another orphan named Ojitos, who is adopted by a blind man and his family. The movie bombed because of its tragic ending, with some have been calling Buñuel's citizenship to be revoked. But after international success, Tepeyac Studios re-released the film a few years later, where it became a domestic success. The film is very self-aware. In the opening scene, the narrator, in order to pass the PRI censorship, disclaims that the movie does not represent Mexico or any of its modern issues, while showing images of Mexico's most prominent monuments. Later in a scene where Pedro is angry for being sent to juvie, he looks at the camera and almost as if he's blaming us for watching the movie instead of jumping into the frame and helping him. Similarly, there's a painful scene where El Jaibo and his gang attack an amputee. The card that the man is writing says, "Me mirabas," Spanish for "you were looking at me." Buñuel points out both the audience's inability to change the fate of the characters and the PRI's lack of initiative to help Mexico's growing crime and poverty. In addition to these fourth wall breaks, Buñuel adds surrealist dream sequences. These sequences are messy and the editing is discontinuous. The sound is out of sync. The slow-mo is very disturbing. One of the dreams even ends with a freeze frame, literally stopping the dream right before our eyes, ending the rule that cinema is a moving picture. This disorientation really stands out as the rest of the movie is very linear and follows a continuous editing style, but they serve as preludes to Buñuel's European works. Windows are also used to show desire. Usually a character will be looking for someone or something to desire. Their faces mimic how the audience should be reacting to the scene. In El, Francisco frantically tries to find his wife by peeking through a window, his crazed face adding to the tension we feel. In Viridiana, Rita watches as Don Jaime attempts to rape his niece Viridiana. Told you it gets weird. Rita's unease and inability to look away is copied by the viewer. Windows also block the audience from receiving information. Sometimes the character will begin to talk, only for the camera to be taken outside and the dialogue cut, adding mystery to the story. Lastly, Buñuel is famous for his melancholic endings. Usually his films end with virtuous characters giving up their goals and letting the world's evils consume them, or being destroyed by the world's evils. In Viridiana, after trying and failing to reform some peasants, Viridiana abandons her Catholic faith and lives in a three-person sexual and unmarried relationship with her cousin and his partner. I told you this movie was weird. In Nazarin, Father Nazarin vows to live in poverty to imitate Christ. In the end of the film, he cries after questioning his faith for the first time. In Los Olvidados, Pedro fails to avenge his mother's rape and is killed by El Jaibo, who continues to be a delinquent. Lastly, El Ángel Exterminador follows a party of rich people who are unable to leave due to an invisible force field. When they think about the needs of others and right their wrongs, the force field is lifted, only for it to be brought down again when they return to their sinful habits. In conclusion, Buñuel added a surrealist touch to Mexican cinema. Other than the movies made by De Fuentes, Fernandez, and Buñuel, few movies actually belong to the CMC tradition. One movie that definitely does belong is Juan Bustillo Oro's Dos Monjes. Released in 1934, it's a German expressionist-inspired story about two monks who talk about their former romance with the same woman after one tries to kill the other. The story is 16 years older than Akira Kurosawa's masterpiece, Rashomon, despite having a similar storytelling technique of one person telling their whole side of the story, followed by someone else telling their side of the whole story. I guess Rashomon effect does sound better than the Dos Monjes effect, but leave it to academia to give the credit to someone else but a brown person. Anyway, the use of chiaroscuro lighting, gothic costuming, and non-linear storytelling makes it a unique entry in Mexico's film catalog. Mexico also had its own unique genre, known as fichera films. The most noticeable are Fernandez's Víctimas del Pecado and Salón México, Julio Braco's Distinto Amanecer, and Alberto Gut's Aventurera, the latter doubling as a rumbera film, which uses rumbera music as its soundtrack. Fichera films focus on ficheras, slang for prostitutes or cabaret dancers. The genre follows a woman forced into prostitution and her attempts to leave it. Usually they're pulled out by a good man fighting organized crime. It's cinema's attempt to comment on the corruption of city life and women's issues, but like most male-dominated industries, it fails to get rid of its sexist stereotypes. Still, some of these movies are a bit ahead of their time. Alberto Goet's 1950 classic Aventurera follows Elena, portrayed by Ninon Sevilla, as she navigates being a cabaret dancer in Chihuahua. Early on, the movie shows a montage of Elena leaving jobs because she's being sexually harassed by her bosses. The commentary was rare, as women had little protections against sexual harassment and didn't even have the right to vote until 1953, which is 3 years after this movie's release. On a lighter note, Aventurera and a few other fichera films have a unique way to present their musical numbers. Instead of the main characters singing about how they feel, it's the band's diegetic music that tells us what the characters are thinking. In this scene, Elena aggressively contemplates the lyrics about breaking free after she rebelled against the owner of the cabaret. It allows the audience time to process what just happened and visualize how the characters feel about what just happened without interrupting the story. Another unique film is 1943's Distinto Amanecer. It was directed by Julio Braco, and the cinematographer was, you guessed it, Gabriel Figueroa. Distinto Amanecer was unique because the main antagonists were members of the PRI's secret police who tried to assassinate a union leader with information the government didn't want leaked. Of course, Braco censored the goons to not have any PRI regalia and had them simply work for the government, whatever that means. Figueroa's chiaroscuro lighting is reminiscent of American noir and indicates the morality of characters, with the protagonist being under brighter light than the secret police. It's a shame that the blend of Mexican fichera and American noir never really was repeated, as the concept is really cool and entertaining. The golden age of Mexican cinema came to an end in the 1950s. Traditionally, the death of star Pedro Infante in 1957 is the traditional end of the age. But as always, the story is more complicated. The good neighbor policy came to an end in 1945 when the Allies won World War II. The US now placed its attention on fighting communism in Europe and Asia, and stopped economically aiding Mexico. This also meant that Hollywood movies could not compete with an on-average lower-budget Mexican film. There's also the death of Agustin Fink in 1944, which meant that less risk-taking producers replaced him, ending many of the creative freedoms that Mexican filmmakers held for granted. The Banco Cinematográfico became more stingy with its money, causing the budgets of Mexican movies to plummet and the schedules to become more tight. Television added extra competition to the already strained industry, and no new filmmakers replaced the auteurs of the Golden Age. De Fuentes didn't make another movie after the Golden Age and died in 1958. Fernandez's films flopped as he couldn't adapt to the demanding filming schedules and tighter budgets of the 1950s. So he returned to acting, and then decided to end his career by murdering someone. Told you this guy was wacky. As stated before, Buñuel was successful in the 50s, creating movies like El, Nazarín, Viridiana, and El Ángel Exterminador. But in the mid-1960s, he returned to France and never looked back. There were some minor Mexican successes in the late 20th century. Released in 1960 and getting an Oscar nomination, there's director Roberto Galvadón's Macario. The film beautifully portrays the importance of Dia de los Muertos and mixes indigenous and Spanish storytelling to tell a great story about the inevitability of death. It also helped that Gabriel Figueroa did the cinematography. There's also 1976's De Todos Modos Juan Te Llamas, directed by Marcela Fernández Violante, the first successful woman director from Mexico. The movie follows the death of a military family during the Cristero War, a conflict between 1926 and 1929, where Mexican peasants rised up against the government after they decided to ban public worship of Catholicism. The movie is famous for its portrayal of the futility of war and how romances and relationships become impossible during violent times. Unfortunately, the 1960s and 80s saw the Mexican film industry basically die. There were very little movies made, and most of them were low-budget melodramas or content for television. But our story does not end there. In the 1990s, there was a resurgence in Mexican cinema called El Nuevo Cine Mexicano, where different filmmakers began to experiment and create new and more bold stories. We begin with Luis Estrada's 1999 satirical political comedy, La Ley de Herodes, which criticizes the authoritarian and austerity policies of the PRI. Then we got the film Como Agua para Chocolate, directed by Alfonso Arau, which pushed the boundaries on the type of sexuality that could be shown in cinema. Then of course the 21st century saw the rise of a new Mexican big three, Guillermo del Toro, Alfonso Cuarón, and Alejandro González Iñárritu. Their films have won Oscars and are globally recognized for their mastery of cinema and use of the cinematic language. Today, Mexico is still a big hub for filmmakers in the Spanish-speaking world. It's still such a shame that outside the Spanish-speaking world, it seems that the only people who watch these movies are people who are descendants of Spanish-speaking people or people who are studying film. And it's such a shame, really, because there's a lot of great movies, so many great and unique stories that you cannot find anywhere else, and a lot of takes on older stories that are just so interesting and different.
So please, just watch one of these movies. I really need someone to talk to.